When the shaman's daughter disappeared for 3 days, no one could have imagined she was falling in love with their greatest enemy. What happened next would shake both tribes to their very foundations and rewrite 50 years of bloody history in ways that would echo through generations yet unborn, changing the destiny of the Amazon itself and all who called the great forest home. This is a story of forbidden love that would either unite two peoples or destroy them both in flames of ancient hatred. The morning mist clung to the Amazon canopy, like the breath of sleeping spirits, wrapping around ancient trees that had witnessed countless generations of tribal secrets, wars, and forbidden loves that bloomed and died in shadow. Massive Cecropia and Brazil nut trees rose like cathedral pillars, their trunks scarred by centuries of storms and human conflict, their branches reaching toward heaven like the arms of praying shamans. The air hung thick with moisture and the intoxicating perfume of night-blooming flowers, rare orchids and crimson bromeliads that bloomed only in the darkness and released their sacred scents to guide lost souls home to their ancestors. The forest pulsed with life, toucans calling across the canopy with voices like sacred flutes, spider monkeys chattering in the distance like gossiping spirits, and the ever-present hum of insects that created the jungle's eternal symphony of survival. Butterflies the size of bird wings danced through shafts of golden sunlight, their iridescent blues and greens flashing like fragments of broken sky. But Kaia felt anything but peaceful as she clung to her precarious perch high above the forest floor, her world balanced on the edge of a knife that could cut both ways. Every fiber of her being screamed with the tension between duty and desire, between the sacred obligations of her birthright and the wild, impossible love that consumed her thoughts day and night. She pressed her back against the massive Cecropia tree, its bark rough and deeply grooved against her painted skin, scarred by decades of storms and the passage of countless seasons. Her heart hammered like thunder during the violent rainy season, when the sky gods waged war above the forest, each beat so loud she feared the searching warriors below might hear it echoing through the canopy like war drums calling for battle. The intricate blue and white spirals covering her arms, marks of shamanic royalty passed down through 7 generations of spiritual leaders, seemed to pulse and shimmer with her accelerated heartbeat, as if the ancient designs themselves were alive with nervous energy and spiritual power. Each sacred design told a story of power, of spiritual communion with the forest gods, of a bloodline that stretched back to the very dawn of her people's history, when the first shamans learned to speak with the spirits of river and tree. Her grandmother had worn these same patterns when she led the resistance against the rubber tappers. Her great-grandmother had painted them before communing with the jaguar spirits during the Great Drought. Now they marked Kaia as the next in line to carry this ancient burden, a burden she was betraying with every breath she shared with her enemy lover. Below her, painted warriors of her father's tribe searched the forest floor with the systematic precision of experienced hunters tracking wounded prey, their urgent voices calling her name through the green cathedral of ancient trees. Each call carried notes of desperation and betrayal. These men who had protected her since childhood, who had taught her the ways of the forest, now hunted her like a criminal fleeing justice. She could see Marco leading them, his young face already painted with the red handprints that marked him as a war leader despite his youth, the crimson designs still fresh and gleaming wetly in the morning light. The other warriors moved like deadly shadows between the massive buttress roots, their polished wooden spears glinting in the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the thick canopy above. Their painted bodies seemed to merge with the forest itself, a reminder of why her people had survived centuries of invasion, warfare, and the endless hunger of outsiders who sought to claim their sacred lands. Each man carried not just weapons but the weight of tribal honor and the burning desire to protect their sacred bloodlines from contamination. They were looking for her, again. Kaia of the Yawanawa, she whispered to herself, the words carrying the weight of 7 generations of shamanic power and spiritual responsibility that seemed to crush down on her shoulders like fallen trees. Daughter of Pashe Nawa, keeper of ancient spirits, guardian of the sacred medicines, speaker with the forest gods, protector of the old ways, bridge between the world of flesh and the realm of spirits. Each title felt heavier than the last, like stones being placed on her chest until she could barely draw breath into her lungs. The names that once filled her with burning pride and an unshakable sense of destiny now felt like iron shackles around her throat, each word a reminder of the sacred trust she was betraying with every stolen moment in her forbidden lover's arms, every secret meeting that spat in the face of everything her ancestors had died to preserve. Because for 3 months now, 3 full cycles of the moon goddess who watched over forbidden lovers with both blessing and curse, she had been living a lie so dangerous and intoxicating it could destroy everything her family had built over centuries of careful spiritual cultivation. Every secret meeting under the stars, every stolen kiss beside the sacred waterfall where their ancestors once made peace, every whispered promise of love was a betrayal that cut deeper into her soul than any enemy blade ever could. The guilt ate at her like poison from the deadly dart frogs, yet she could not stop herself from returning to him, drawn like a moth to flame that would surely consume her completely. The sound of breaking twigs and rustling leaves made her freeze like a deer sensing the approach of a hunting jaguar, every muscle in her young body coiled like a serpent ready to strike or flee at the first sign of true danger. Someone was climbing toward her hiding spot with the fluid grace that marked a true child of the forest, someone who had learned to walk silently on leaves and branches before they could properly speak their first words. The movement was too controlled and purposeful to be one of her father's searching warriors, too careful and deliberate to be a wandering animal seeking fruit in the canopy. Her fingers found the ceremonial bone knife at her waist, the same sacred blade her grandmother had carried into battle against the rubber tappers 40 years ago, stained with the blood of those who would destroy the forest. But when the familiar figure emerged through the emerald curtain of leaves like a vision from her dreams, her weapon fell forgotten to the forest floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo like thunder in the tense silence. Itamar. His name escaped her lips like a prayer to gods who probably cursed her for speaking it, like a sacred incantation that had the power to summon both salvation and damnation with equal measure. The sound of his name felt dangerous on her tongue, as if speaking it aloud might alert the forest spirits to their transgression. He was everything her people had taught her to fear since she could walk and understand the ancient stories of war and hatred. Kaia, poor warrior, blood enemy, ancient foe whose very name was whispered as a curse around Yawanawa fires. The intricate geometric patterns painted on his bronze skin told stories of raids against her tribe, of Yawanawa blood spilled under full moons, of children stolen from their mothers, and warriors killed in brutal dawn attacks that left entire families mourning. Each line and dot represented a victory, a conquest, a life taken in the endless cycle of revenge that defined both peoples. The red and black lines that decorated his muscular chest and arms marked him as a son of the legendary chief Raoni, the man her father called the demon who walks upright, the warrior whose name was used to frighten Yawanawa children into obedience and whose reputation for ruthless cunning was known throughout the Amazon basin. But when Itamar looked at her with those deep brown eyes that reflected the forest canopy like dark pools of sacred water, eyes that held depths of gentleness she never expected to find in an enemy, Kaia saw only the man who had saved her life 3 months ago, the gentle soul hidden beneath the warrior's terrifying exterior, the heart that beat in rhythm with her own despite all the reasons it should not. She remembered that day with crystal-clear precision, every detail burned into her memory like a sacred tattoo that would never fade from her soul, the vision quest that had gone terribly wrong when she had wandered too far from the sacred boundaries her people had established, driven by spiritual visions that clouded her judgment and led her astray. The massive jaguar that had stalked her to the hidden waterfall, a legendary beast the size of a small caiman, its yellow eyes promising swift death, its powerful muscles rippling beneath spotted fur as it prepared to leap for her throat with killing intent. The mysterious Kaia warrior who had appeared from the forest like a forest spirit given human form, driving off the great cat with nothing but raw courage, lightning reflexes, and a wooden spear that seemed pitiful against such a magnificent and deadly predator. He could have killed her then and there, could have brought her head back to his people as a glorious trophy that would have earned him songs and stories for generations. Instead, he had tended her wounds with surprisingly gentle hands that contradicted everything she knew about enemy warriors, and spoken to her in broken, carefully practiced Yawanawa words he must have learned just to comfort her, asking if she was safe, if she needed help returning to her village, if there was anything he could do to ease her pain. In that moment, bleeding and vulnerable, she had seen not a monster but a man, not a killer but a protector. The realization had shattered everything she believed about the world. "You shouldn't have come," she breathed now, even as she stepped into his powerful arms, feeling the familiar sense of coming home. "Neither should you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion that matched her own. "But here we are, defying gods and men." His hands traced the delicate patterns painted on her skin, blue and white spirals that marked her as shamanic royalty, designs that told the story of her bloodline stretching back to the first Yawanawa who had spoken with the spirits. When his fingers touched her face, she forgot for a moment that those same hands had probably taken enemy lives, but the truly shocking thing was what neither of them knew yet. That very morning, as the first light of dawn painted the sky, the color of ripe acai berries, and the forest began its daily symphony of awakening sounds, Pasei Noir had received a vision from the forest spirits, a vision so clear and terrible it had made the old shaman's weathered hands shake as he prepared his sacred ayahuasca, spilling precious drops of the holy brew onto the earthen floor of his ritual hut. He had seen his daughter's betrayal with perfect clarity, witnessed her secret meetings with the enemy, and received a prophetic glimpse of events that would shake the very foundations of both tribes. As Kaia melted into Itamar's embrace 50 feet above the forest floor, completely lost in their forbidden love, her father was already painting his face with the sacred red and black patterns of war and divine justice. The young lovers had no idea that their secret meetings by the sacred waterfall, where the spirits of both tribes were said to dance together in ancient times, had been discovered by Kaia's cousin Marco during his own hunting expedition. They didn't know that Itamar's father, the fearsome chief Raoni of the Kaia, had been growing suspicious of his son's long absences, and had already arranged a marriage between Itamar and Yaira, a warrior maiden from the fierce Shingu tribe. Most importantly, they couldn't have imagined that their forbidden love was about to trigger a conflict that would end in blood, betrayal, and revelations that would rewrite the history both tribes had believed for 50 years. Kaia pulled back slightly, studying every line of Itamar's beloved face in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy. The scar above his left eyebrow, where a tapir had kicked him as a child. The strong jaw that spoke of Kayapor's stubbornness. The lips that had whispered words of love in 3 different languages during their stolen nights together. "My father grows suspicious," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the constant symphony of bird calls and insect songs that filled the rainforest like nature's own sacred music. "Yesterday, he asked why I spend so much time gathering healing herbs by the river border. He knows those plants grow closer to our village. His shamanic intuition grows stronger with each passing day. I fear he can sense the change in my spiritual energy, the way my aura has been altered by our forbidden connection." Itimar's jaw tightened, and she felt the tension ripple through his warrior's body like electricity through storm clouds. "My people ask the same questions. They wonder why I hunt alone, why I return empty-handed when the forest is full of game. Yesterday, my father's war chief suggested I might be meeting with enemies, his eyes burning with suspicion that could ignite into violence. He cupped her face in his calloused hands, hands that knew how to shape deadly arrows and wield war clubs with lethal precision, but touched her with infinite gentleness that contradicted everything her people believed about Kayapor warriors. "Kaia, we can't keep meeting like this. The risk grows with every sunrise, every stolen moment. If they catch us, I know." Tears gathered in her dark eyes like morning dew on spiderwebs, each droplet catching the filtered sunlight like tiny crystals of pure sorrow. "But I can't stop. When I'm with you, I forget that our people have been enemies since the time of our great-grandfathers. I forget that my bloodline carries the responsibility of shamanic power that stretches back through countless generations. I forget that loving you could mean death for both of us, and war between our tribes that would drench the forest floor in blood." She pressed closer to him, breathing in his scent of forest and smoke, and the special red clay the Kayapor warriors used in their sacred pre-battle rituals that prepared them to face death with courage. "Sometimes I dream of running away together, far downriver, where neither tribe ventures, where the great river meets the sea, and dolphins dance in the waves. We could build a house by the water, raise children who would never learn to hate, who would grow up knowing only love and peace, and sometimes I dream the same dream," Itamar murmured against her hair, his breath warm against her ear. "But we both know it's impossible. You carry shamanic blood, your people would hunt you to the ends of the earth, through every river and forest, and I am heir to a chief's power. My father would rather see me dead and dishonored than living as a coward in exile, abandoning the warrior's path that defines our very existence." At this very moment, everything was about to change forever. A howler monkey's warning cry split the morning air, but the sound was wrong, too sharp, too rhythmic, too perfectly timed and calculated. Both lovers froze, recognizing the human signal that meant danger was close, very close, closing in like a predator stalking prey through the undergrowth. "Very close. Run," Itamar whispered urgently, his warrior instincts taking over, but it was already too late. The bushes around their hidden grove exploded with movement as painted warriors surrounded them, emerging from the forest like deadly spirits of vengeance given human form. Kaia's heart plummeted to her stomach as she recognized the lead figure, her own cousin Marco, his young face twisted with betrayal and rage that burned like sacred fire. The red handprints painted on his chest marked him as a war leader, despite his youth, and the expression in his dark eyes promised violence and bloodshed. "So the rumors are true," Marco spat, his ironwood spear pointed directly at Itamar's chest, the sharpened tip gleaming with deadly intent. "The great shaman's daughter spreads her legs for Kayapor scum, like a common whore from the river villages." The crude words hit Kaia like physical blows, but she forced herself to stand straight, drawing on generations of shamanic pride. "Marco, cousin, please listen to me." Silence. Her cousin's eyes blazed with the fury of the betrayed, with the righteous anger of a warrior whose honor had been insulted by the actions of his own blood. "Do you know what you've done, foolish girl? Do you understand the shame you've brought on our bloodline? Father Nawa's vision showed him everything. The spirits themselves weep for your betrayal." The ancestors turned their faces away in disgust. Behind Marco she could see other warriors she had known since childhood, men who had taught her to track jaguars and identify poisonous plants, men who had carried her on their shoulders during harvest festivals, men who now looked at her like she was something diseased and contaminated, something that needed to be cleansed with fire and blood. Itamar's hand moved slowly toward his war club, but Kaia caught his wrist. She could feel the coiled violence in his muscles, the instinct to fight that had been bred into Kayapor men for countless generations. But violence now would only prove their people right about each other, that love between the tribes was impossible, that only death could end their ancient hatred. "You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet. There's something you don't understand," Kaia said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins like liquid fire. "Itamar and we've discovered something about our tribe's history, something that changes everything our people believe about each other." Marco's spear wavered slightly, confusion flickering across his painted features. What lies do you speak now, cousin? What stories has this enemy filled your head with? Kaia looked into Itama's eyes, seeing her own desperate hope reflected there. They had been planning to reveal their secret discovery to both tribes, but not like this. Not at spear point with death hovering over them like vultures circling a kill. But perhaps this was the only way it could happen, in crisis, with truth as their only weapon against hatred. 3 months ago, when we first met, it wasn't by chance, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. We were both searching for the same thing, the truth about the Broken Treaty massacre that started our tribe's war 50 years ago. The warriors shifted uneasily, hands tightening on weapons that had tasted enemy blood in countless raids. Every child of both tribes knew that story by heart, had grown up hearing it whispered around nighttime fires. How the Kaia had betrayed a peace meeting, slaughtering Yawanawa elders under a flag of truce beside the sacred waterfall. How Chief Raoni's own father had led the attack, cutting down men who had come to negotiate marriage alliances and trading agreements. It was the wound that had never healed, the reason for 5 decades of blood and hatred that had claimed hundreds of lives. And what did you find, cousin? Marco demanded, though something in his voice suggested he already feared the answer. What truth could excuse your betrayal of everything we hold sacred? Itama stepped forward, his warrior's pride overcoming caution. We found the real killer's burial ground, hidden in the caves behind the waterfall, with proof of what actually happened that night 50 years ago. Wait, don't miss this crucial detail that changes everything. The silence that followed was profound, stretching like a bowstring about to snap. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath, as if the spirits themselves were waiting for words that could reshape history. It wasn't the Kaia who broke the treaty. Kaia whispered, her words falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread outward until they touched every life in both tribes. It was the gold miners, white men who wanted our lands divided, who wanted us killing each other instead of united against them and their endless hunger for our sacred territories. The revelation hit the warriors like a physical blow, like lightning striking the great Cecropia tree. Spears lowered, painted faces went slack with shock, and several men actually staggered backward as if the words themselves carried physical force. Marco's spear wavered slightly, confusion replacing rage on his painted features. That's impossible, he breathed. The evidence, the witnesses, were all lies, Itanpao said quietly. We have the miners' journal, written in their own language, describing how they massacred the elders and left Kaia arrows to frame my people. They knew that as long as our tribes fought each other, we would never band together to drive them from our ancestral lands. But you won't believe what happened next. The sound of approaching footsteps announced new arrivals, and the warriors parted like water to allow passage for 2 figures that made both young lovers' hearts stop. Through the green wall of jungle stepped Pahenawa himself, his weathered face painted with the sacred patterns of judgment. The designs covered every inch of his skin, spirals and diamonds and serpentine lines that told the story of his shamanic power. Behind him came a figure that made Itama's breath catch in his throat, his own father, Chief Raoni, flanked by 6 Kaia warriors whose faces were painted for war. The chief was everything the stories claimed and more, tall as a Cecropia tree, broad as a tapir, with scars that mapped decades of battles against enemies both human and animal. The jaguar tooth necklace around his throat marked him as a man who had killed the forest's greatest predator with nothing but a wooden spear and raw courage. His presence filled the grove like a thunderstorm approaching, making even the veteran warriors step back respectfully. So, Pahenawa said, his voice carrying the weight of mountains and the wisdom of centuries, each word falling like stones into still water. The spirit's vision comes to pass exactly as they showed me. My daughter and the enemy chief's son, united in betrayal of everything their ancestors died to protect, everything their bloodlines have held sacred since the dawn of time. Father, please listen to us, Kaia began, but her voice sounded small and weak after the shaman's power. I have heard enough lies. The old man's eyes blazed with spiritual fire, and several warriors actually stepped back from the force of his rage. You have disgraced our ancestors, brought shame upon a bloodline that stretches back to the first shamans who spoke with the forest spirits. The punishment for consorting with enemies is exile from our lands, or death by poison arrow. Chief Raoni stepped forward, his massive frame radiating controlled violence like heat from a blazing fire. When he spoke, his voice was like the rumble of distant thunder rolling across the Amazon basin. My son has violated every law of our people, every sacred tradition passed down through generations. He has forgotten that Kaia blood runs pure and strong, that weakness is death, that love for enemies is the path to destruction. What you've seen so far is nothing compared to what comes next. Kaia felt the world spinning around her, as if the great tree spirits were shaking the very foundations of the earth. This was the moment she had dreaded in her darkest nightmares, when love would demand the ultimate sacrifice. She looked at Itamar, seeing her own desperate resolve mirrored in his warrior's face. "Then we choose exile," she said, her voice ringing clear and strong through the grove. "Together, we'll leave both tribes and never return. You'll never have to see us again." But Pashe Nawa shook his head slowly, and his smile was terrible to behold, the smile of a man who held all the cards in a deadly game. "There will be no exile for you, daughter, because you carry something that belongs to our tribe, something sacred that cannot be allowed to leave with you." Kaia's blood turned to ice water in her veins. "What do you mean?" Her father's eyes glittered with terrible knowledge. "The spirits have shown me everything, child. In my vision I saw the truth your body hasn't yet told your mind. You carry the next generation of shamans in your womb. My grandchild, a being of power who will be born with the gift of speaking to forest spirits, will not be raised by enemies." The revelation struck like lightning splitting a tree. Kaia's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, and she felt the world rearrange itself around this new reality. The morning sickness she had attributed to nerves, the missed bleeding time she had ignored in the chaos of their secret love, the strange dreams filled with infant cries and spiritual visions. Understanding dawned in Itamar's eyes at the same moment, and she saw wonder and terror warring in his expression. "You won't believe it, but the most shocking twist is still coming." Chief Raoni's expression shifted from rage to cold calculation, and suddenly he looked less like an angry father, and more like a war chief planning strategy. "A child," he murmured, his voice thoughtful, "half Kayapo, half Yawanawa, the first of mixed blood born in 50 years of war. Kill them both," Marco snarled, his spear rising again. "End this abomination before it can grow and spread its poison to other young fools." "No." Pahinawa raised his hand, and the authority in that gesture was absolute. "The spirits have shown me another path." The old shaman's eyes glittered with terrible purpose as he looked at the two young lovers clinging to each other in desperate fear. "You wish to be united in love, so be it, but your union will serve our tribe's needs, not your own desires. Kaia will bear her child in captivity, watched by guards from both peoples. When the baby is born, it will be raised to become either a bridge between our tribes, or the ultimate weapon to finally destroy our enemies. And if we refuse," Itamar asked, though he already knew the answer from his father's implacable expression. "Then you die now," Chief Raoni said simply, "both of you, and the child dies with you." The forest fell silent except for the whisper of wind through leaves that sounded like the voices of ancient spirits offering warnings to those wise enough to listen, and the thunder of two young hearts breaking in perfect unison as their impossible situation closed around them like a trap forged by fate itself. Somewhere in the distance, a toucan's call echoed mockingly through the canopy, as if the forest itself was commenting on the tragic irony of their situation. Two souls meant to be together by love, divided by centuries of hatred and blood that stained the very ground beneath their feet. The very air seemed to thicken with tension, pressing down on them like the weight of history itself, heavy with the ghosts of all who had died in the endless war between their peoples. Kaia looked at Itamar, seeing her own impossible choice reflected in his warrior's eyes, eyes that now held not only the weight of fatherhood, but also the crushing burden of leadership he would never be allowed to inherit. In those dark depths she saw their entire future stretching out before them, a life lived in shadows and secrecy, or no life at all. The child growing within her womb would either bridge two worlds or be destroyed by the hatred between them. Love had brought them together across the seemingly unbridgeable divide of ancient tribal hatred and generations of spilled blood. Now it would determine whether they lived as prisoners of their own peoples, raising their mixed-blood child under the constant watch of suspicious guards and political maneuvering, or died as martyrs to a peace that might never come, their love story becoming just another tragic tale whispered around tribal fires. Just when they thought their fate was sealed, the sound of drums began to beat in the distance, drums that carried a message that would change everything once more, drums that spoke in the ancient language only shamans could truly understand.